Okay, this video is going to focus on the mouth and all the way through swallowing and into the esophagus. It looks like Dr. Lynn maybe took out some text slides here, so I'm going to pause on this picture and on the next picture for just a little bit because there's a lot going on and I want you to be clear on what I want you to memorize and what I don't. So this is the oral cavity. It's also called the buccal cavity sometimes. And so here's some things that you are familiar with, like your lips and your teeth, and then maybe some things that maybe you're not so familiar with. So here I definitely want you to know the hard palate and the soft palate. We'll talk about those, and you should know what the uvula is and where it is, and then we'll talk about these salivary glands and those ducts, but if you see the sublingual and the submandibular are down there under the tongue, that's also a good thing to memorize. But the rest here is just kind of a little bit overkill. So we know that our chewing and mastication starts here in the mouth or the oral cavity, and we're going to get to that here in just a second. For the tongue, again, there's a lot going on, but you will need to know the epiglottis. We'll be referencing back to that. You should see that on the body of the tongue, that's where we see all of our taste buds, which are papilla. And then the root of the tongue is the back part that is connected. And so just know the difference between the body and the root. I'm good with that. And the rest of these, tonsils and sulcus, I don't need you to know those. Okay, so within the oral cavity we see teeth, and we're going to look at the anatomy of the tooth a little bit, but not too much. First I want to point you to the right hand side of that tooth picture where it shows the brackets. The crown of the tooth is the part that sticks out from your gums, and then the root of the tooth is the part that is embedded in the gums. The tooth is covered in enamel on the crown and the neck of the tooth, said to be the hardest part of the hardest substance in the body. And then with underneath the enamel we see dentin, which is hard yellowish tissue that makes up most of the tooth. The human mouth has lots of microorganisms inside, especially bacteria. We see these within the oral cavity. That kind of lists a few different categories that we see. Plaque is on the teeth. It's made of bacteria and sugar. And then bacteria within the mouth are metabolizing sugars, releasing acids. And then this talks about what a root canal is. That's kind of stuck in the middle of nowhere there. But for me, on the tooth, I need you to know the crown, the root, enamel, and the dentin. It talks about the apical foramen at the bottom. That's the entrance where the arteries and nerves are entering the tooth and leaving the tooth. So that's probably a good spot to know as well. Okay, so these teeth in our mouth are for chewing, which is going to be referred to as mastication. We know that our food needs to be broken down. We talked about that in the previous video. Breakdown of the food is to help it be in smaller pieces for us to swallow, but more importantly, exposing more surface, and so the digestive enzymes kind of have more surface area to work with. The food itself is what stimulates the oral receptors that start the involuntary chewing reflex, and this is the first step in mechanical digestion, is our chewing. This talks about that the tongue, the muscles that work together to manipulate our food. And then we're going to talk about where it goes next. But before we do that, we need to talk about these salivary glands. So saliva is released into the mouth. It moistens the mouth, cleanses our teeth. It also begins starch and fat digestion. So this is the site of chemical digestion for starches and fats. It inhibits bacterial growth and moistens the food. At this point, we're going to start, maybe call it a bolus for a little bit. A bolus is kind of a clump of food that has already been chewed but has not been swallowed. And so the saliva itself is made up of mostly water, but there's some other things in there. The enzyme to help the starch, or to begin the starch digestion, is called amylase. There's also some lipase that is activated by the stomach acid, mucus that helps to swallow, enzymes that kill bacteria, immunoglobulin A that slows down or inhibits bacterial growth, and then electrolytes as well. But mostly water. The pH of our saliva is from 6.8 to 7, so mostly water, but all of those other important components as well. And so that saliva is coming through salivary glands. That's where it is created and excreted. And so we have two categories of salivary glands, extrinsic and intrinsic. Extrinsic is probably what you know about already. This kind of gives you the main ones within the oral cavity: parotid, submandibular, and sublingual. And this tells about where they empty to. And then the intrinsic are glands that are tucked into other oral tissues. So we don't really think about them. We can't really see them as well when we dissect, but they do all secrete saliva that's emptying into the mouth. So our swallowing, your book actually breaks this down into 3 components. I think Dr. Lin was just kind of tightening things up here, but we'll talk about all 3 of the components. The first is in the oral phase, and that is a voluntary phase. So we talked about the food is actually what's kind of starting the chewing, and then once that bolus forms and it gets large enough, then we have this urge to swallow. So that is the voluntary phase. And then the involuntary phase, your book breaks up into the pharynx and the esophagus phase. So it actually breaks it down into 2 phases instead of just 1 like it is here. And so the pharynx section of that is so that we kind of stop our breathing for just a second so we don't choke. And then the esophagus part is where we actually see the beginning of peristalsis. Peristalsis is the involuntary contraction, and we're going to see that throughout the digestive tract, but especially here in the esophagus. It's where muscles are contracting for the downward movement of this food. And so we see that first here in swallowing. And so the pharynx has these constrictors that are muscles to help the swallowing occur. And then this talks about the esophagus. It doesn't really give you a whole lot of information about the esophagus, so you should definitely read through that. It is a muscular tube that's 25 to 30 centimeters long, and kind of talks about where it's tucked into the body, and kind of the different layers of the esophagus. But compared to what we need to talk about later, I feel like this is why Dr. Lin kind of cut it out, is because there's way more important stuff to talk about in the digestive system. The esophagus isn't too exciting. Sorry about that, I kind of knocked that over. So in our next video, we will get into the details of the stomach.